So I think most of you, well, who knows where most of you fell on this one. Turns out I would argue that a student loan is far riskier than a home loan. Not necessarily because of the underlying ability of an individual to repay it. Implicitly, I think that was something we would hold constant. Rather, the issue is with a student loan, what do you repossess? Do you go in and suck out the knowledge out of somebody's brain? That's pretty tough. Home loans, on the other hand, are easier to collateralize and to claim the collateral from. How about a home loan or a car loan? Turns out car loans are far riskier than home loans. Now again, there's always the issue of the type of people and who's there and whether they'll repay and whether they won't. Adverse selection, asymmetric information. There's a whole bunch of considerations. However, cars are mobile. Homes are somewhat mobile, but you have to actually stick them on big trucks. Big movers, I don't remember. Discovery had a show a few years ago that was on home movers, I think was it. It is possible to move homes, but it's a lot easier to move cars. Sorry about that. Turn that on silent. Again, why are these riskier? Part of this involves how easy it is to provide collateral. And then, as we've already talked about, well, as I've just alluded to rather than talked about, there is some question as the type of people who show up. Now, here's something to note, and this is something that many people, including people who teach finance, get wrong. Bonds are not priced with an interest rate. An interest rate is a specific thing. An interest rate is a specified contractual amount that you are obligated to repay if you borrow money. Bonds don't have that. What bonds have is an amount you pay me as the borrower, you as the lender, and an amount that I repay you. This, again, as I mentioned earlier, can be a face value, a specific balloon payment in the future, with no payments along the way, or it can be payments along the way plus an amount in the future, or just payments along the way. So it turns out that while we have interest rates in markets, bonds don't have interest rates. You will have coupon payments that are calculated as a percent of the face value, but except for a very, very small subset of bonds that are called index bonds that are going to pay a specified rate, almost all bonds are priced not in interest rates, but rather they are priced as a face value, and there's the amount that you pay for that promise. But it turns out we can convert them. And so this is where we're going to bring in a formula, which actually has a lot of breadth and depth besides this topic, besides this class. It's what we call basically getting into the realm of time value of money. So let's take something that you have paid $950 for. It's going to pay you back a year from now, and the amount that it's going to pay you is $1,000. So now nowhere in there is there any interest rate specified. Rather, this is a contract. It simply says, I will pay you $1,000 a year from now. And then the question is, in a bond market, how much do you pay me? And people compete and they argue, etc. And let's say we settle on a price of $950. So you give me $950 today for the promise of $1,000 a year from now. What is the yield on this bond? Now you'll notice there is no interest rate anywhere in here. This is, by the way, a zero coupon bond. In this case, we can use our percent change formula, which hopefully is somewhat familiar to you folks. Our new minus our old divided by our old times 100 if you want it in percentage terms. I will acknowledge that I'm a little bit lazy. I switch back and forth. Hopefully you'll develop that ability to think in terms of decimal or as percentage. And so in this case, this would have a yield, a promise of this, a bond of this would be a 5.26% annualized yield. Yeah, I implicitly dumped in a times 100 there. Now, here would be another question of what would the price on this bond have to be in order to get you a yield of 10%? We put the same thing into the formula in, again, times 100 at the end, and we can work through some algebra. X1 times 0.1 equals 1,000 minus X1, so 1.1 X1 equals 1,000. We divide 1,000 by 1.1. Oh, wait, I've already done this. And what do we end up with? We end up that 909. So any price below $909 for this promise will yield more than 10% of a return. This turns out to be a pretty powerful formula. Hopefully you've already seen this. I'm darn sure you've already seen this. This is growth rates. This is just our percent change formula. The issue with this gets a little bit this gets a little bit more complicated as we spread it across years. So one of the things, and it also gets more complicated once we add in coupon payments. But one of the big things, this stylized fact that people make a lot out of, and that is at least, thank goodness, it's been, 25 years since I took a finance class? But one of the things I remember most vividly from my finance classes was this really interesting puzzle. That when the interest rate goes up, that's what I'm abbreviating with R here, the real interest rate goes up, bond prices go down. And this was presented as this stylized fact that was just sort of true. And you start saying, well, why? In other words, there's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the price of a bond. Well, it turns out we would expect that equally risky assets are going to have the same rate of return. Now, if we were in class, we could start drawing things up here. But basically, what's going to happen? So first of all, the gap between the price that you pay for a bond, the bond price, and the time-adjusted stream of payments, that gap is your return. And so, now think about this. Contractually, the face value, the payment or the stream of payments in the future are fixed by the terms of the bond. So if interest rate goes up, in order to get people to continue to buy this bond, what needs to happen? Well, the yield has to go up. Because if the yield didn't go up, what would happen? People would say, screw you, I'm not going to buy this thing. I'm going to go do the thing that gets me the higher return. As we've already talked about, the interest rate, the real interest rate, is the payment to the savers. And so if I can get paid more in one location than another for the same risk, I'm going to take the higher payment. And so in order to get people to buy the bond, the issuers are going to have to accept a lower price. And not because that's anything fancy, but because the gap between the price and the face value or the contractually specified terms is the yield. And so when the interest rate goes up, that gap has to get bigger, which means, this isn't some wizardry or weird thing, it means that because of competitive markets, when the interest rate goes up, bond prices have to go down. Hopefully that A is something you've already heard, but B is not something you now find particularly confusing. Now, we would expect equally risky assets to have the same rate of return. And the reason for that would be, let's take the same good. I mean, you can think back to principles and you can think about arbitrage. And you could say if cigarette lighters are selling for $1 in Nevada and $3 in Billings, what's going to happen? Well, it would make sense for us to go down, somebody to go down to Las Vegas and buy a bunch of lighters, stick them on a truck, send them to Billings, and sell them until the price converges, holding constant or ignoring the cost of transportation, right? So we wouldn't expect prices to fully converge. And that's the same thing here. If the assets have the same risk, then we would expect them to have the same rate of return. Otherwise, people would rush to the higher valued asset, and you could think about drawing up a supply and demand schedule. There would be a dramatic increase in the demand, which would bid up the price of that asset. There would be a decrease in demand elsewhere, which would bid down the price of that asset until they would have the same rate of return. Okay. Now again, we're going to have to talk in terms of nominal versus real. We'll return to this. Now here's a more complicated form of our bond pricing situation. So this is a situation where we have payments along the way and a final payment. And what's happening here is the 1 plus R being the discount rate. Now I put that in as the interest rate because that is how it's commonly used. Now again, if we were in the classroom, we could have a reasoned discussion why in finance classes or in mini classes you use the interest rate for R instead of the discount rate. We can't have that discussion. Maybe in our chats we can have that discussion, but this here is the discount rate. And so the key here is that the intuition behind this formula is that the further we go out into the future, the more we discount that. In other words, $1,000 a year from now is worth less to me than $1,000 6 months from now, which is worth less than $1,000 tomorrow. And so what we need for this to match our intuition is that the further out in time we go, that the denominator gets larger. And that's actually what happens here. Now, exactly the specific ratio, we could talk about this. I'd have to go talk with somebody in the math department or somebody who is more knowledgeable about this than I am. But the key for this formula to match our understanding of human beings is that final payment, say we had a payment a year from now. So this is a situation where I promise to pay you. Let's say I'm going to promise to pay you $100 every year for the next 10 years. I hope you understand that $100 10 years from now is worth less than $100 9 years from now, and so on and so forth. And none of that has anything to do with the fact that you can invest money or the fact that there's going to be some inflation or that there's uncertainty. It hinges at its root, base, foundational level on the fact that we as human beings are impatient creatures. $100 10 years from now, that's worth a lot less to me than $100 today. And so all we're doing here is saying a stream of payments, say that's $100, the final payment, payment 2, payment 1, etc. Those are all $100. The one 10 years from now should be worth a lot less than the one today. And in order for that to happen, the denominator has to go up as we go out in time here. And so let's look at this for any of you who are curious. So let's say we have a 10% discount rate. So we would divide payment 1, 100, by 1.1. And I can pull up my calculator here and see what that ends up being. I don't know off the top of my head. Let's see, 100 divided by 1.1 is $90. So basically the equivalent value of a payment a year from now, if you have a discount rate of 10%, today is around $91. Now, that's not particularly germane. That matches our intuition of human beings, which is, okay, we're impatient. Now, 1.1 squared, and so that's 1.21. So if we take 100 divided by 1.21, instead of being $90, that's $82.64. So that value falls. The payment stays the same, $100, but it falls. And let's take a look at $100 10 years from now. So let's see if, for some reason, my calculator is not wanting to do this. But, and I'm not going to waste our time here, but I can say that $100 divided by 1.1 to the 10th power, and that n, by the way, in the formula should actually be t being the time period. So 1.1 to the 10th power is going to be larger than 1.1 to the 9th and larger than 1.1 to the, and so on and so forth. And so that $100 10 years from now is going to be worth a lot less. And so it turns out we can use that exact same formula. Now I might write it up a little bit differently. I would use summation notation. Maybe I'll try and do that. I hadn't anticipated that. Basically, the previous notation here, all you would do is you can add the sum from t equals 1 to n being the total number of time periods, of x sub t over 1 plus r to the t. Again, Some of you in accounting have learned this using actuarial tables. Some in finance have learned specific formulas depending on whether it's perpetuity and so on and so forth. This is the generalized form for the present value of future cash flows. But again, this is the general form, and it turns out that in your upper division accounting or your finance classes, you could annoy the crap out of your professors with most of the formulas that are subsequently written by saying, wait. Isn't that just a special version of the present value calculation? To which your professor will say, hopefully, if they know what the hell they're talking about, they'll say, yes. So it's a very powerful formula. You can look it up in actuarial tables. You can use a financial calculator. But again, it's not a really complicated formula to know, and it applies for much beyond bond pricing. So, as I mentioned, bonds are not just corporate bonds. We also have government bonds. And just to clear up some jargon that people may run into and that you almost certainly will run into in your life, at least I did. I didn't think I was going to, but I definitely ran into it later in my life, was there are these things called T-bonds, and there's these things called T-bills, and there are these things called T-notes, and these are clearly crazy different things. So here's what these are. Treasury bonds or T-bonds, typically. Now these are U.S. government. Other governments have similar specifications and similar jargon. They'll be different depending on the country and so forth. But T-bonds here are typically 30-year, 6-month coupon bonds. In other words, the federal government guarantees to repay you a certain amount 30 years from now, and for every 6 months along the way, they will make a payment to you. We also have Treasury notes. Treasury notes are somewhere between 2 and 10 years, 6-month coupon. So, wait, they're not different than T-bonds? Really, T-notes are just a short-term T-bond. And then we have Treasury bills, and Treasury bills are 26-week, zero coupon, typically. So what does this mean? Not much. They're just even shorter week, or shorter time period. Now you might say, why 26 weeks? Hopefully it jumps out to you that there's 52 weeks in the year, so these are really 6-month bonds. So they're just much shorter maturity. Now again, throughout this, we always talk about bond yields. Bonds do not pay interest rates. However, we would expect bond yields and market interest rates to converge for reasons I've already covered. As an example of this, you can look at, now this is from back in 2009, right? We had a discussion about the spreads on Spanish bond yields. And right here we even have, now again, this is 2011, we have the gap here, bond yields. Now what are these compared to? These are all pretty much being compared to German government bonds, because that in Europe is considered the equivalent of American U.S. Treasury bonds, which are viewed as some of the least risky assets available. In the jargon of finance, oftentimes they'll talk about these being zero risk, but they're clearly not zero risk. There is a risk that the federal government will default. It's just lower than there is risk for pretty much any other country. And so in Europe, we have the comparison, the spread here. Actually, this is not the spread. This is just the percentage. But it shows us a spread between Portuguese government bonds, Irish government bonds, and Greek government bonds. So stop for a moment and try and figure out what this actually might tell us about the relative riskiness of Greek, Irish, and Portuguese government bonds. And the answer here is, I'm not going to stop because I kind of like to finish this up and move on, but the answer is that Greek bonds must be riskier, not necessarily because you think the government is junk, but because you think the situation in Greece is bad enough that the Greek government is less likely to repay. It's not saying they're necessarily malicious or going to default on this. It's simply saying that the likelihood of the Greek government repaying must be lower than the likelihood of the Irish government repaying, which is lower than the likelihood of the Portuguese government repaying. But again, the point that I'm trying to make here, well, two things. One is that bond yields, whether on governments or on corporations, tell us something about the assessment of millions and billions of people of their relative riskiness, the likelihood that they're going to repay. So that's one thing. It's what yields can tell us. And again, we have to answer the how do you know that question. But if I said, hey, I think the Greek government is doing a terrible job and the Greek economy is in the crapper, this would be probative information for that point. The other point I just want to make again is that responsible agencies and individuals talk about bond yields, not bond interest rates. Now I love this picture just because it's kind of cool. I love this drop. So this was Greek government bonds, and this was a while ago, but you notice this thing on the right, this dramatic drop. So this was so say we have the spread here. In other words, the price of Greek bonds is going down, which means the spread between the promise of payments and the price is going down until we hit March, at which point the price of Greek bonds goes up and the spread goes down. And even if you don't know what the hell happened here, you can look and say something's going on. And the answer here as to what caused this dramatic change was that dramatic drop is when the European Central Bank back in 2011, 2012 guaranteed Greek government bonds. So stocks, what are stocks? Well, stocks are a share of ownership, and owners have a share in the profits, but they also share the risk. They can lose money. And so buying some stock, as I've already talked about, is simply a transfer of ownership. So if I go out and buy a share in Apple or Amazon tomorrow, pretty good chance I've purchased that from somebody who already owned it. Actually, it's assured that that has happened. A small share of stock purchases are used by the business for new investment in our terms as economists. And usually this falls under the heading of IPO or initial public offering, but sometimes other firms will do it to increase their capital. And so stocks also have risk. They have default risk and they have profit risk. So stocks are typically riskier than bonds, and they are also typically riskier than bank accounts or banks. However, stock markets do allow people who are saving their money to transfer it across the bridge to people who are looking to invest. Now, are there any other intermediaries? Sure. There's family, there might be religious organizations, payday lenders catch a mean rap, but really what they're doing is engaging in financial intermediation. So hopefully this makes some sense. Obviously, if you have questions, that's what our class will be, to answer those questions. The key here, one of the things is, do we understand that financial intermediaries stand in the middle? Hopefully. And do we understand that we can also break this bridge? Again, breaking this bridge will largely involve messing with institutions. Of course, as we sit right now, radical uncertainty can also break the bridge. However, radical uncertainty is only going to break the bridge for as long as that uncertainty persists. And so persistent fractionation of this bridge must involve bad institutions. Uncertainty can persist in the current situation for a couple months, as we don't know how we're going to deal with COVID and so forth. But to persist long term, it will require unpredictable action by presidents and legislators. Now, as we hopefully already know, insecure property rights are going to make people unsure as to whether they should send their money across the bridge, because if they send their money across the bridge, can they get it back? We also have issues like price controls. I hope you understand that. We already worked through wage and price controls. Price controls on sending money across the bridge are the same as any other price controls. Initially, there will be shortages if it's a price ceiling. On the other hand, if it's a price floor, initially there will be probably surpluses. We're going to have to, again, talk about inflation here before too long. There's also big considerations about politicized lending. Again, this is one of my reservations as we move into an era where the federal government tries to encourage banks to lend to local businesses. I'm not sure what to make about that. There may be good reasons to do it, but it also makes me very nervous. We also worry about bank failures. That can break the bridge, right? So if enough banks go under, and it's a widespread thing, it's not just one bank, we would want, if there was one bank that was engaged in irresponsible behavior, we would want that bank to go under. However, if banks generally go under, not because they've engaged in inappropriate behavior, but because maybe there are things beyond their control, yeah, then we might worry. This system of financial intermediation may break down and less money will make it across the bridge. A lower rate of savings will make it into investment, and hopefully you can all pull up your solo model right now and figure out what that would mean. In effect, while there might be the identical amount of savings on the left-hand side of the bridge, there would be a smaller amount that makes it across, which would mean our investment line would shift down as our investment line decreases despite our savings rate staying the same, which would mean regardless of where we were in terms of our amount of capital, we would have a lower rate of growth going forward. Now, radical uncertainty about the world also tends to make people less willing to send their money across the bridge. And something, again, we haven't fully talked about here, but we can go back to government borrowing. Government borrowing will increase the demand in aggregate, but it will also increase, as a result, the price of borrowing, which will cause private individuals to cut back. And so if government borrowing is used frivolously and not productively, the end result of government borrowing will be, again, a shift down in our investment line in the solo model. If, on the other hand, government agents and government bureaucrats use the money more effectively than private individuals, then our investment line, in effect, would shift up because it would be being used more productively. And the answer to which is the case, are these resources being used more or less productively, is almost certainly a function of how effectively we've overcome the information and incentive problems. Okay, so that's it for financial intermediation. I suspect and hope you all have some questions that you can raise in class during our chats, and something you can, a parting gift here, you can go through and list off what you think each of these qualifies as. I'll leave you there and we'll reconvene in class. Hope this was helpful.